So let's take a look at how to do 2D motion blur and 2D depth of field and how to utilize our render layer setup within Nuke. So I'm going to jump into File, Open, jump into Depth of Field, Motion Blur, Start, Chapter 11, and then I'm just going to jump into my project settings and set my project directory to relink up all of our nodes. And we're going to get to our render layer setup, but first let's just talk about the vector blur and the Z to focus node. So in order to do 2D motion blur, we'll drop in the vector blur node. We'll plug that into our setup, and we'll select our UV channels, so motion vectors. We will do motion amount 0.5, just like that, and we'll set the motion vector presets to V-ray velocity. So you notice we're getting a lot of edging issues, right? If we go over to our no filtering pass, you'll see it doesn't really get much better. And if we jump over to the filtered version of the render that doesn't have the fence, it still doesn't really hold up. Sometimes if you hit this normalize button, a lot of the edging issues that we're having here do get better. So you can see, like in this case, there's like this weird transparency stuff happening here. So if you hit that normalize button, a lot of times it does help. I more often than not keep that off, but more often than not I'm not actually rendering this way anyway. So let's take a look at Z to focus really quick, and then we'll jump over to our render layer setup to actually how to fix this. So Z to focus, drop that in, I'll plug that in, and by default our depth.z channel is selected, which is what we want in this particular case. And then what I'm going to do is choose my focal point and really crank up the size, just like that. You can see now we're getting our depth of field. So in this specific case, we may get better results using our no filtered pass here. You can see that it does clean up their edges, but it does leave us with some pretty jagged edges as well. If we check out what's happening, we get these nice smooth anti-aliasing, and then if we check out our Z to focus, it starts to get jagged. So those are the basics. Let's talk about our render layer setup and how we can utilize this stuff and actually gain more control without having artifacting. I'm going to drop in a merge node, so I'm going to select those two, hit M, and we'll make sure we're going A over B by hitting Shift X, and then we'll merge our fence in as well. So we'll Shift X that as well. So now you can see we have these three separate layers rendered completely separate, and we're matching one for one of what we were getting before. So now let's start talking about vector blur and Z to focus on this. So I'll drop in a vector blur node, just like that. And we'll do the same setup before, UV channels, motion vectors. We'll do motion amount 0.5. You can see we're getting some edging, some edge issues happening here. But if we switch over from our motion vector presets from scanline render to V-ray velocity blur, you can see we're getting some nice results. And in this specific case, normalize is off, and we're getting much better results. So that's vector blur. But now let's add in a Z to focus. I'm going to apply this to our background first. So we'll apply this to our background image. We'll choose our focal point, which will be somewhere right here. And then I'll just really crank up this size and amount right there. So something like 30. So again, we're getting clean results. But now if we apply this over here, you're noticing we're going to start getting some edge issues again. So this is really where unpremultiplication of our depth passes become very important. I'm going to temporarily disable our vector blur. You can see it still doesn't get better. But if I come in here and drop in an unpremult, you'll see it's going to extrude out even more. But we don't want to unpremultiply our RGB pass, which is this. We want to unpremultiply our depth pass like that. So now if we jump into our depth channel, we'll see exactly what's happening. You'll see that this is sort of mimicking that unfiltered look, and I think this is a lot of the confusion that people have in the industry is they see this and they're like, okay, well, this must not be filtered, but actually this is filtered. It's just unpremultiplied. So it has all the anti-aliasing there. We're just unpremultiplying that depth pass. And essentially what's happening is if we unpremultiply it and we check out our depth result, you can see we're not getting any artifacting now. Everything's lining up really, really well. So why is that? If we turn off unpremultiply, we're getting all this edging, and if we turn that back on, it is all cleaned up. Well, if we jump into our depth pass, you can see exactly what's happening. Right now, these transparent results, if we jump back to RGB, even though they're slightly transparent, they still need to be blurred the same amount as the pixels around it. And when we unpremultiply it, that's exactly what we're telling it to do. We're essentially extruding that edge out, and we're saying, hey, blur this pixel the same amount that we're blurring right here. Otherwise, what it's going to do is blur this a lot more, so 0.04 amount rather than 0.42. So those values are very, very different. But if we keep that unpremultiplied, you'll notice that those values don't change very much, and we can actually give it the same amount of blur all the way to the edge. So now if we check in our RGB, you see that we're not actually getting much artifacting at all. And if I copy and paste this over to our fence, you can see we're getting awesome results. And again, if we unpremultiply that depth pass, all of our artifacting comes back into place just like that. But because we are unpremultiplying that depth pass, we're telling exactly to blur the same pixels that you're blurring over here, you blur over there. So how do we combine vector blur and Z to focus? Well, if we jump back to our Z to focus over here and we enable our velocity blur, you notice we're still not getting edge issues, because if we check out our unpremultiplication, if we check out our depth pass, that's what happens. So even with the most transparent pixels that are way over here, those are still going to get blurred the same amount that we're blurring over here, which is really, really awesome. So let's take this to the next level and set up a procedural depth pass within Nuke. So this depth pass, is we set it up in 3D, so it has all those values baked into it. But what we actually want to do is set up the point position camera pass as our depth pass and not actually use this built-in depth pass that we set up in V-Ray. And that gives us the flexibility to be able to change those values on the fly within Nuke and not have those values actually baked into our render. So I'm going to give us some room to work by moving this up. And I'm going to get rid of our unpremultiplication of our depth map because we're not going to use that anymore. I'm going to shuffle out our point position camera pass. So point position camera. I'm going to shuffle out jump back into our RGB here. So I'm going to shuffle the blue channel into all the channels because essentially that's going to be our depth information. And we still want to continue our alpha because we're going to have to do some unpremultiplication. So what I'm going to do is in the 2 slot, select our GBA and then choose our alpha from that. So now we're actually grabbing our alpha from our original RGB and then we're just shuffling in the Z depth information from our point position camera pass. So let's take a look at what that looks like, just like this. And for the time being, I'm just going to turn off velocity blur. I'm going to unpremult our point position camera pass, just like we did our Z depth pass. So those edges will be unpremultiplied. And then what we're going to do is just drop in a grade. And our black and white points are going to work just like our black and white points did on our Z depth render element. So our white point is going to be 0. And then to set up our black point, what we're going to do is just utilize our background render layer. So I'm going to switch this tree over. And then I'm going to select our black point and then select somewhere back here all the way up in the corner. Just like that. So now if we take this tree back over to our original, we're noticing that we're getting all these lifted values around here, and we want to get rid of those. And the way we do that is just by premultiplying. Now, essentially what we want to do is unpremultiply this depth pass that we just made, just like we did before. So we'll do an unpremultiplication. So essentially, this gets rid of that, just like that, and then we unpremultiply, and that'll be ready to go into our tree to do our Z to focus. So I'll drop in a shuffle node, or shuffle copy rather, and then we'll shuffle 1 into 2. So we'll shuffle our RGB over here into our depth pass channel over here, just like that. And now if we go into our Z to focus, we're noticing we get those same exact results. But now instead of being locked down to our V-Ray depth pass render elements values within our depth pass over here, we can actually change these on the fly, which is really powerful. Cool. So now we can re-enable our velocity blur. And now if we just copy and paste all this information, I'm just going to backdrop this, just like that, and copy this, paste this for our set, just like that. So we'll merge that in at the very end. And then the same thing for our foreground over here. So I'll just get rid of all that and then paste this and then hook all that up. And now if we check out our results, we'll see we're getting a lot of transparency, a lot of depth information, a lot of velocity blur happening, and there's no artifacting at all. It's all pretty clean. And now we can start doing things like if we come in here and really crank this up, I'm just going to hit pause on the nuke render right there, just so we can crank this up to something like 100 on all of our Z focuses. Just like that. And if I go all the way to the very end and then just unpause this just like that, you'll see now we're getting an incredible amount of depth of field and motion blur, and it's all transparent and it's all perfect and not giving us any artifacting at all whatsoever. And just to recap, we've been talking a lot about filtering and unpermultiplication and all that kind of stuff. The real reason why this transparency is actually able to happen in this extreme amount is because we have pixel values that are there that weren't there in our render before. So to elaborate on that, if we come over to our original render that had everything baked into it, and we just check out an area like this. Currently, this foreground is so defocused that it nearly becomes completely transparent, which means we have to be able to see pixel values that are behind it. And if we render all these elements together, it can't possibly do that. Same thing with the vector blur information. If this is being blurred, we're going to need to see information behind here, and we can't do that unless we render this separate. So utilizing all the filtering and unpremultiplication techniques in combination with these render layers is really the key here. So again, if we check out like this area right here, you'll see we're getting a little bit of depth of field and a little bit of velocity blur, and it's all just perfect. So what if we want to start doing something like we want to actually come in here and play around with individual render elements to rebuild this beauty, say for this teapot back here. What we can do is bring in our Beauty Rebuild Hybrid. So I will insert comp nodes, go to presets, Beauty Rebuild Hybrid, and we'll put all that stuff there. So the order of operations here is really, really important. You never want to rebuild your beauty pass after you do your velocity blur and your 2D depth of field. You always want to do that beforehand. And with that said, if we come in here and check out what we're getting, we're going to see we're going to be getting some artifacting again. Why is this happening? Essentially, our template up here needs to be pre-multiplied by all the channels again. So we'll pre-multiply that by all the channels, and that will get us back. So essentially what's happening is up here, we're doing pre-multiplication of all the channels. And by default, the way we had this set up was just to pre-multiply the RGB. So we'll pre-multiply all the channels to get them back to the original. So when we start doing unpre-multiplications down here, everything hooks up okay. So now if we want to come in here and start doing stuff like, we'll take the specular information and gain it up a bunch, and then put a glow to do some specular blooms like that and really crank that up. Just like that. We're going to be able to come down here and be able to do the Z blur and the motion blur and not have any issues at all. Just like that. So in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at deep compositing and how to integrate that into our workflow.